We are Think Company. If you haven't heard of us before, Think Company is an experienced design and technology consulting firm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We do work all over the country. We got folks scattered in different places all over the country. We're primarily in Philadelphia. We started this, wow, I think this is like the 8th seminar we've done or something like that, webinar we've done. It all started with a few of our folks were going to be presenting at South by Southwest, and that was canceled, and we decided to put those talks online instead, and we've created this great webinar series that we're doing around different topics in experience design technology. We have a few other ones coming up. Speaking of other webinars, first, if anyone's working in a frontline response organization, we've been offering free problem-solving workshops for those organizations. If you have any interest in that, you can go to our website. There's a card on our website where you can go and fill out a form with some information about what kind of help you're looking for, and someone in our team will get back to you there. We also want to promote, we have a design and health crawl coming up. That is June 11th. From 5:30 to 7 p.m. This again was a live event that we were going to be doing with a bunch of other design organizations in the Philadelphia area. Jefferson University's Health Communication Design Department, Digitas Health, Design Science, and Think Company. So folks were going to be jumping from one studio to the next throughout an evening and learn about design and health. We moved that online. And registrations, you can follow the thinkpost./design and health, and we'll send a link out to that at the end of this webinar. It'll be in a very interesting way to learn about how other design agencies are dealing with healthcare issues. And I think it's pretty pertinent topic for what we've been going through the past couple of months. And finally, we have the next webinar coming up on June 4th is one of our founders, Brian McIntyre, is going to talk about building something great, 6 principles for building a great company. So that'll be a really exciting talk, and I think that our co-founder, Carl White, will be coming in for some Q&A at the end of that session as well. So if you've got some time on June 4th, you want to come in and learn about essentially how great organizations like Think Company are founded and built, come on in for that webinar as well. So before we get started with the webinar, just to go over a couple of ground rules, just to let you all know, you're all muted by default. That's the way the webinar platform works. We will start live Q&A sometime around 3:45. We can go as long as 4:30. So we advertise the event to end at 4. If anybody has time to stick around after 4 o'clock, we'll keep Q&A going until we run out of questions or we run out of time. So if you do have questions for us, please post them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. There should be a button that says Q&A for you. Not in the chat feature. Someone will gently remind you to post it over in Q&A if you post something in the Q&A feature, so that we can use some of the other features in there. Other folks who maybe don't have questions yourself, you can still upvote questions. That's why we want them all over in Q&A. I'll monitor that channel and choose questions for that session at the end. If I select your question, I will try unmuting you first and introduce you to ask your own question so you can have a conversation with Amanda and Shawn. If you want to be anonymous, then you can just post the question anonymously, and in that case, I'll ask it for you. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, just depending on time. And we do have people in chat and Q&A or monitoring over there while the presentation's going on. So if you run into any problems or have any questions directly for us on an administrative level, you're more than welcome to ping us over there. I'd love to introduce our 2 speakers today. Amanda Kalk is Think Company's Principal of Engineering Management. She's been with Think Company since 2013. In her time at Think Company, she's worked in a variety of big and small projects, including creating design systems, integrating front ends with complex CMSs, and implementing various front-end frameworks, including Angular and React. Amanda works with teams to create development strategies, establish standards and best practices, and provide guidance in adopting new technologies. She's worked on and off with project teams from ADP to Comcast to Ascensus. Shawn Hickman is an imaginative visual and UX designer. He's worked with clients like Ascensus, Transamerica, and Comcast to conceptualize and bring design systems to life. He's practiced in leading research interviews and engaging thoughtfully with people who use products, believing strongly that candid feedback and user input will always lead to the most valuable outcome. Shawn is an optimist and lifelong learner. I like making him laugh. He's always up to the challenge of tackling something new and innovative. One thing I love to point out, he has a knack for product design and iOS app design. He tinkers himself in iOS development, so he has a little bit of knowledge of the engineering side as well. And if you want to experience something that he's been tinkering around with, he has a great app out there called Sofa. You can download it in the it's only in the Apple App Store, right? It's in the App Store, yeah.
Yeah.
You can download it. It's a very cool tool. I use it all the time. You can keep track of books, movies, TV shows, podcasts, albums, video games. You can also check it out at sofahq.com. I looked up the URL for it, Shawn.
Phil, you're so prepared. I love it.
Second plug for Shawn there. So
Love it.
without any further ado, I would love to introduce these two people. Some people refer to them as the two persons Destiny Child of design systems. Here they are, Shawn and Amanda.
Awesome. Thank you, Phil. All right. Such a nice, non-awkward introduction. You know, it's what we all want in life. Okay, so today we are going to talk about why your design system isn't working. And all things considered, starting a design system is relatively easy. We actually see this all the time. Our clients start design systems. Sometimes they start multiple design systems. And that's actually the easy part. The hard part is the evolution, right? And evolving that system once it's started and starting to be used, and how do you kind of take it to the next level? And there's a lot of different reasons why your system may not be working today, or not working as well as it could be. And we're not going to get into everything. We're just going to focus on a few things. But no one is using it, treating it like a one-off project, and no progress being made. But this is a very big topic. So let's start with no one is using it. So the main metric for any system is adoption. If no one's using it, if no product team's using it, that kind of thing, it's kind of like, what's the point? The whole intention of building the system is to have teams use it and have people use it. So that adoption is the main thing here. One of the things that we've seen where it can be a barrier to that adoption where no one's using it is that it's a little too one-sided. So for systems to be really successful, it's important that design and development are true partners there. And when they are not true partners and you don't have that participation across those groups, what you'll see is a lot less motivation across those various audiences to adopt it and to even, contribute to it in any meaningful way. So if you're maybe in this situation, or, you want to start to figure out if you are, some questions you can ask yourself are, is my system only designer driven or only developer driven, or maybe it's mostly one or the other? This is actually like a pretty simple question for a lot of teams to answer, but maybe they just haven't thought about it before. Another one too is that it's not just about the role of designer and developer, but it can also be, the product. Like, is it too focused on a single product? Most design systems are started focused on a single product, and then as they grow, they need to expand what they do to be more adaptable for various products and various needs. But if the system is still too focused on that original product, it can be hard for additional teams to pick it up and start using it. So some of the things you can do to help with this kind of lopsided, one-sided system, number one is just seek collaborators, right? So, if you're a designer and you haven't been working with developers, it's, reach out to developers and start to try and build those relationships and find people who can be strong advocates for this, or even start contributing to the system, and vice versa if you're a developer. And not, it's really like, don't restrict the work to just people within your little bubble. It's, expand it out to people outside of that, because you're going to get a lot of good feedback. The other one is do some research, right? So if you're finding that, hey, developers aren't adopting this, or designers or different product teams, just basic product research, which is like, well, understand the barriers to adoption for those various teams. What is either difficult or hard for them to do to start using this thing. And then you can take that and then start to make adjustments. So it's a lot easier for them to do. And then finding common ground. So with these lopsided systems, usually they're built lopsided as well. So the tooling and the information will be, either in a bunch of design tools that aren't accessible to developers or in developer tools that aren't accessible to designers. So that can make it difficult for those people to even be involved at any point. So by using something like a storefront, which is a central source of truth, you can have that common ground for all people to kind of have access to the information. Another big reason why people aren't using it is that it's difficult to use. And this is something that this is true of any product. If you think of any software product that you've used, if it's difficult to use, it puts the question in your head that, should I invest the time to use this thing and to learn it and to integrate it into my process? Or should I just abandon it and just go back to what I know? And 9 times out of 10, people will just abandon it. So it's really important that you figure out how to make this very, very easy for those teams to adopt. And some of those questions you can ask are, a very simple, excuse me, a very simple one would be, if someone had to start using this system today and you were not there to explain it to them, how would they do? Would they be able to do this, or would they really struggle? And if the answer is that they would really struggle, then your system's probably too hard to use, right? One of the other things is the tooling, right? So again, we kind of hit on this in a previous slide, which the tooling may be a barrier to entry. So depending on the organization structure or the team that's like building this, maybe they don't have access to those tools, or maybe the way that the organization pays for software, not everyone has access to all the same things, or there's OS restrictions, like it's not cross-platform, that kind of thing. So even understanding those things can be really helpful to making it a lot easier for people to use. So some things you can do are, number one, stick to basics. It's very easy for designers and developers to make things really complicated because it's kind of fun to do that. It's fun to like, oh, this tool is really interesting. It can do this and I can combine it with this other thing. And that can be fun, but if you're someone who's just adopting the system, that additional overhead is just too complicated. So it's really sticking to the basics and then adding complexity when it makes sense. Quick start guides. So this is very minimal documentation that can happen, where it's a very small investment on the system side to just write some quick starting points for either designers or developers to get up and running with this. It doesn't even have to cover everything. It's just like what's enough to get people going so they're not just completely stuck at a dead end with this stuff. And then the last point is clear points of contact. So if someone inevitably runs into a problem or they have a question, do they know where to go to get that question either resolved or to even ask it? And that can be as simple as like, do they know that they can just email you or Slack you, or maybe there's like a group of people or a Google form or something like that, right? You can make it as simple or as complex as needed, but just making it clear that there needs to be a point of contact is something that you can very easily do. And this third one is around no guidance. And this is similar to the previous one, but it's a little more specific to documentation. And documentation is, it can be seen as like the boring part, but we actually kind of love it because it's really how, it's really like the glue between everything. Like it's not enough to just give people a box of parts and say, here, go build this thing. You really need to give the instructions with it and the context behind things. And even some things that, people aren't anticipating. And focusing on like, missing documentation, stuff that's incomplete or out of date, and trying to make sure that stuff is taken care of. So, some questions here. Number one, you may have great documentation, but one of the questions is, do people know it exists? It sounds like an obvious question, but maybe no one knows it's there. And just by telling people it's there consistently, that can start to resolve the issue. The other one is like, okay, I know it exists, but can I get to it easily? Is it in some, kind of random system that doesn't make sense within the company? Or do I have to remember like a login every time I have to use it? Like adding that, having friction to easily get to the documentation can be a problem as well. And then stuff around documentation being out of date, you know, depending on the situation, can actually do more harm than good. So, you know, it's like, should I have this documentation if I can't maintain it? Or what's like the bare minimum I can do where it won't quickly become out of date, that kind of thing. So some things you can focus on here to you know, help with the guidance of this and to get people using it is, number one, use a storefront. Storefronts are such a critical part of design systems. You know, you have the UI library piece, which is, you know, what everyone focuses on, but the storefront is that source of truth and really brings everything together. So if you have a question or want to know anything about the system or get some information from it or download something, whatever, you go to the storefront. And that can be done with tools that you're already using, things like Confluence or Notion or SharePoint or Storybook, right? Or you can build something custom if that makes sense as well. But having that is really important. Prioritizing documentation updates. One of the things that happens frequently is when people are like creating a new component or style or updating a component or style, documentation is not really part of that work. It's more like, yeah, we'll do documentation later. But we actually push for including documentation as part of that. And that component is not complete until documentation is written. And that avoids the issue of pushing the documentation down the backlog, essentially, where it just you never quite get to it because it's never quite a priority. But this can be a good way to make sure that the out-of-date documentation isn't a problem. Where there are like, sometimes like there just isn't time to update things, and that happens. And a simple way to help mitigate that is, you know, using like out-of-date tags. Or wherever you have your documentation, just like very clearly saying like, this is out of date, right? And it's kind of like a marker for if someone stumbles upon it, they can very easily just say, oh, okay, I'm not going to read this. Or if I read it, I'll read it with, with caution. And this is something that can take 30 seconds to do. So the next one is no progress being made. So if you think, so, let's say you started a system and that system has seen some initial success, which is great. The problem is an organization, the products inside of it and the people inside of it aren't stagnant. They don't just stay the same. They're constantly evolving in small and in large ways. And if the system isn't evolving with them, then it's going to very quickly become out of date and irrelevant. So one of the big things here is like, don't set it and forget it. Really, like, design systems are not crockpots. And if you have the mentality of set it and forget it, it's just quickly going to become irrelevant for the people who are using it. And they're going to very quickly stop using it. So some very simple questions you can ask here are, when was the last time you made changes and made updates? If it's like very infrequently, it's like, okay, what can we do to start to improve that? Maybe there's like smaller things you could release. You don't have to wait for these big things to be done, right? The other part is like reevaluating what success looks like, because after that initial success, you may have different information, like new information that, okay, we want to take the system in this direction or not this direction, that kind of thing. And kind of figuring out like, what does success look like for us short-term and long-term? So a couple ways you can start to improve on this piece is communicating updates, right? So maybe you are updating all the time, but again, you're just not communicating stuff. You're going to notice like some patterns here where there's some very simple things that you may not be doing that, you can implement and just say, oh, we can tell people that this is happening. And pushing those out and even having like a simple tool like a changelog can be a good way to show that progress. Because when teams are evaluating, like, do we adopt this system, they need to figure out like, well, is this system going to be here tomorrow? And by showing constant updates and a changelog, that gives it like builds trust that, okay, I trust that this thing is going to be here once we adopt it, and it's not going to be abandoned. That's like a big metric for kind of considering whether something can be used. Defining success, like what does success look like, and being realistic about that as well. Around, okay, what does the team look like today? If the team's really small, maybe you don't, have these crazy success metrics that you're going to try and shoot for in a year that aren't really realistic. So defining what that success looks like, but then also communicating that out so people's expectations are set appropriately, because maybe the system is successful, but it's just people's expectations don't match that. And the last thing is around tools. So this is more of like a tactical thing, but I think people feel like there's a little bit of analysis paralysis when it comes to tooling for some of this stuff, where it's like, oh, do we use Figma or Sketch or XD or Abstract? Like there's so many things even on the design side, and then dev is like 10 times more complex. And it's like, okay, make a decision what makes sense today, and you can always change it. Like you can always upgrade tooling, you can upgrade processing and make things better over time. But it's just, make a decision and kind of go from there. So no time to work on it. This is a big one that we hear about all the time. And really, when you just kind of think about it, the lack of dedicated time combined with motivated people to work on the system is, the system is just not going to succeed. It's just kind of impossible, because the time and the people that's the oxygen for the system to even survive. So one of the things that happens pretty frequently with this is people will say, oh, well, I need to be full-time on the system, and that, number one, you may not actually need that depending on where the system is. And that may not be practical based on your situation, the company's situation, that kind of thing. So, number one is like figuring out like, well, how much time do you actually need to keep moving this thing forward, right? And you'll notice like none of these things are in isolation. So this is all combined with like, setting, defining what success is and stuff. So all that stuff factors into this. The other part too is like, have you asked for time? Sometimes there can be a little bit of fear around asking for things. But I mean, the worst people can say is no. And it's like, and then that's actually an opportunity you can take and say, okay, so why isn't this a higher priority than maybe something else? Or, how could we make this more of a priority? Or what is it about this that you don't see as worthwhile, right? So it's a good opportunity to learn how your company and business thinks about this stuff. And maybe there's a way to kind of re-educate on the value here. So a couple ways to kind of handle this no time to work on it thing. So number one is this idea of establishing a staffing model, and there's a couple ways to do this, but it focuses on the things we just talked about, which is, okay, well, how much time do you need? How many people do you need? Maybe that doesn't have to be one person. Like maybe that can be spread across a few people so that the impact to the business isn't as high, right? So a few people get some time, maybe every week or every month or every quarter or something like that. It's just kind of like taking those baby steps to get started. The other one is like, just go build stuff, right? This is definitely going to be a call depending on your organization, but sometimes the best way to get stuff done is just to go do it. Find passionate people that are excited about this and just do it. And that's a great way to demonstrate the value of this thing without necessarily having to like, sell the idea. It's just like, well, we sold the idea by doing it and showing the value. And then the flip side of that is, creating like a pitch deck, right? So we've been talking about this internally, where a design system is kind of like a startup within a company. And that's, there's multiple ways that startups kind of like attack, their either market or their product. And one is like, they just go build stuff and then the VCs come to them, right? Or they build enough and then they go, sell it, and they have a pitch deck and they're going out to get funding and that kind of stuff. There's no right or wrong there. It's just different approaches. And I think it'll vary depending on the organization as well. But, selling this thing. And when you sell it, it's not just thinking about what you need, but also like how this will benefit the product, how this aligns with the organization and how the company makes money as well is going to be really important for that. And the last thing here is around leadership, or lack of leadership. And when we think about leadership here, this is, again, true of any kind of product or team or anything. When there's no leadership, it's really hard for teams to kind of move forward, even with simple things around decisions. If people are struggling on like what to do, having someone there or a small group there to be able to like make a decision and keep the team moving forward is really necessary for this stuff, where it can be very easy to get bogged down in the weeds on things. So number one, is it clear who the decision makers are? If the answer is no, then that's like kind of an immediate thing you need to figure out. Maybe that person is you and you can just start making decisions, or maybe, you need to kind of elevate it up the chain. And then even if there are clear decision makers, are decisions being made? Sometimes the lack of decisions being made can be worse than, any decision. So it's kind of an interesting point around the decision piece. And these two things here are, these are, kind of saying the same thing, but slightly differently. And this kind of comes back to like the team aspect too, where the leadership of the system doesn't necessarily have to be one person. There's a lot of benefits to having diversity here, to having people of various backgrounds, various skill sets. And again, the design and dev, like true partnership here is really important, because you can't make those decisions in a vacuum. And this helps for the system to scale, especially at the beginning where resources might be really tight. So if certain people don't have the time for a few weeks, others can help kind of keep moving things forward. So it's a way where, one person doesn't become a blocker for, the system making progress.
Okay. I'm going to take over from here. We got one last section around these things. The last one being treating it like a one-off project. So when you treat something like a one-off project, you're working towards a single goal or a set of goals. Once you meet those goals, if the project's over, it's done. In long-term projects, you're usually creating more strategic decisions around making short and long-term goals. And you have to do things like evolving and maintenance in order to make sure that product continues to grow. So documenting and communicating those strategies really help you maintain buy-in from your organization, and that will help you move the system forward in general. So one of our first points here is around no roadmap. So having a roadmap, whether it has timelines or not, really helps you capture what the future intentions of your system are in a place that's public and people can see it. It doesn't guarantee that things are going to happen, but it at least makes your intentions visible so that when you want to talk about your system and when you want people to adopt it, they can go and see, oh, there's a roadmap. There are intentions for this thing to move forward. So some of the questions to ask yourself around here, whether or not your future goals are documented. Do you have both short and long-term plans? Are you regularly reviewing that roadmap? And is your roadmap a shared vision, or is it based off of like an individual product, person, or need? Is it a one-sided system, that kind of thing? So some of the success things that we look for in this area are around, a simple thing like creating a backlog. It doesn't have to be super formal. You can put it in the tools that you already use if it's something like Jira, but it also could just be, a running document in Confluence somewhere, a public place where people can put things that you want and plan on doing for your system. Reviewing that backlog with some sort of regular cadence is also very important. So I recommend something like once a quarter, but ideally more often. That way you're able to communicate out how often you're actually refining those items and talking about them. And then lastly, make sure you're being realistic with yourself and others. Set the right expectations for what you can accomplish and the kind of the timeline of when you expect to accomplish those things. Working on design systems can be really hard and really discouraging when it comes to evolving them. When you don't have time, when you don't have the support and you're constantly trying to get that stuff, being realistic in your own goals can really help make sure that you don't get burned out while trying to do these things. Next up, we have poor communication. So we've talked about communication a lot, but the idea that design systems are bigger than one team or product, you meet with your product teams every day. You often know what's going on with your product because you're in close proximity to those people and actively talking. That type of communication isn't so organic when it comes to design systems. And sometimes you kind of lose sight of that because you're in there, you're talking about it, you feel like you know what's going on, but not necessarily everyone else knows what's going on. So some of the questions you can ask yourself here, have you told anyone about it? Do people know that your system exists? Do people know that you have plans and strategy moving forward? How do they find out about updates and changes? Are you soliciting and collecting feedback? And if you're not working on your design system every day, when's the last time you heard about a design system within your organization? So some of the things here to make sure that your communication is pretty solid, just having a communication strategy, making sure that you've defined how you're going to communicate out specific things like new changes or big changes, and making sure you're keeping in mind both active and passive audiences. So people who are going to sign up for an email blast or people who you know are using it, those are the people you think to communicate to. But you have to also remember that there are people who are going to be interested in your system who are going to come and look at things, whether it's for history or they're new, and they want to have access to that stuff as well. So making sure that your strategy is balanced between both active and passive audiences. The second part here being around feedback loops. So communication is really a two-way street. We've focused a lot so far on the idea of making sure you're communicating out and people know these things exist. But you also want to make sure that you're providing a good place for people to provide you with feedback and have the ability to let people know the status of those things. I think like one of the worst things that can happen is when you find out that there's some humongous problem from like all of the organization is talking about it. And it's like a 5-minute fix that if you had just known about it, you could have fixed it before it became like such an escalated issue. So providing a place to be able to capture that feedback can prevent emergency situations like that. And then lastly, hosting events. These don't have to be formal. You can do things like an open crit where people come in and talk about what they're doing in regards to the design system, or they can talk about some webinar that they just went and listened to about design systems. It also can be things that are more prepared, like lunch and learns, where you have people who know the system well going out and kind of preaching and talking about the system. This is a great way to spread awareness about what's going on, but also helps you build a community within your design system like ecosystem to start to bring more people in to try and help you grow your system. And then the last point we have here is around no continuity or lack of continuity. So we've talked a lot about how normally people don't have dedicated teams within design systems. People are really coming in and out frequently trying to get things done. That can be a really big deterrent because there's no continuity between the people that are working on it. There might not be history. It might be all in like 2 people's heads. So you need to incorporate that idea that there's going to be this, people coming in and out for small amounts of time into your strategy to make sure that people can actually get things done and aren't just deterred by time to help contribute. So some of the questions you can ask around these things, are you capturing major decision points for people to go and look at and understand? Are the expectations for contributing to your system clear? And if I left my design system project tomorrow, would it live on without me? I think that one hits hard, whether or not something would live on it if you weren't there. So some of the strategies here for battling the no continuity. Something like having decision records, so keeping track of the decisions that are made in some centralized location, whether those are design decisions or development decisions, so that new people can come in when they're wondering, why the icons are the way they are. And some decision had to be made because one product needed them in this specific way and it made sense for everyone. You're not having the same conversations over and over again when you have these decisions that you can go back and reference. That preserves history that normally is preserved in people's heads, that often goes away when there's no continuity in a system. The second part here around documenting process, again, we've talked a lot about documentation, but a lot on the consumer side or adoption side, people who are trying to use your system. You'll also want to make sure that it's clear how the system works behind the scenes, so that when people do want to contribute, it's straightforward for them to come in and make a contribution without having to track someone down to really talk about things before they can go about doing that. And then the last one, well-defined to-dos. So this goes really hand in hand with that idea of having a backlog. Having a backlog is great to capture intention, but having well-defined to-dos in that backlog allows people to come in and pick up things with minimal guidance. If I have half a day to dedicate to working on a design system, and I need to track someone down to meet with that person before I can even understand what the options are of things that I can do and how I can do it, I'm a lot less likely to do that than if I can go look at a list of things, click on ones, have all the details that I need right there, and then jump in and do it myself. So that brings us to a little bit of a story time. I wanted to run through a specific scenario of a thing that we've worked on in the past that I call the fast and furious developer-driven scenario. It's this idea that we started a design system out of a project that we didn't intend to start a design system with, but we went ahead and continued to evolve that over time. So when the project started, there were kind of two sets of goals in place. There's the stakeholder goals, the reasons that you're brought in for a project. There was a 6-month timeline. We wanted to modernize 2 applications. These applications were super out of date. They didn't really look alike, even though they did very similar things. So we wanted to match the design across both those applications. And we wanted to move as fast as we possibly could because this was a 6-month timeline. On the product team side, while we were aligned with the stakeholders' goals, we also had our own ideas of how to do some of these things to make sure that we could reuse as much code between applications, try to future-proof anything new that we were writing so that it could be used in the future, and then move as fast as possible because we had to move as fast as possible. These goals all together really made us realize, like, this is a very good candidate for a design system project. We didn't come in expecting it to be that, but in order to meet these goals in that fast of a way, we thought, going with a quick and dirty design system solution would be the best way for us to keep moving. So to give you a little more context about what this project ended up looking like, the team was very small. We had 2 full-time UI developers, 1 per team, working with like fully staffed development teams using the pattern library and design system. And then we had 2 part-time designers who were supporting each one of the products, who had other work on their plates as well. So they were really tuned in with their individual products and not necessarily the full system as a whole. In terms of tooling, the designers were using Sketch. We were using Zeppelin to hand off designs from the designers to the developers. The developers were working in 1 repository for the pattern library. We were using a tool called Harp.js, HTML, CSS, and jQuery, which matched up with the tech stack of the applications. And then we deployed that whole thing as a single NPM package to be able to use the same code versioned in each of the applications. Because the team was so small, communication was mostly done on Slack. It was pretty easy for us to communicate through that. We didn't need a lot of other tooling there. And then in terms of process, it was fast and furious. So new components Designers would hand off those designs to developers. We did a little bit of foundational stuff, made sure we had those primitives and frequently used components in place. For existing pages, developers were deciding which components they should be using. And if there was a component that didn't exist, or we couldn't figure out, like, this thing doesn't really make sense to go in an accordion, but you know, we might need something new, or expand it on the accordion or something like that, we would bring it back to the designers and have the designers help us through making those decisions. And then lastly, we relied on constant and informal communication for feedback and alignment. So like I said, the developers were fully dedicated, the designers were not. The developers often had to keep the designers on the same page because the designers were very focused on their products. So the developers would meet and say, okay, I have this design, you have that design. These are very similar. Let's go back to design and see if they can, like, bring these things back together. And that was a lot because of time. It wasn't nearly, like, really neglect. We just kind of forced this system in where we wanted to, and we're bringing the designers along for the ride. So, you know, the design system and that project was super successful. We were able to move super fast. We were done before the timeline. We were able to do a lot more than anyone expected us to be able to do. But now what? You know, we got to this point where we had created this design system, and we had kind of created unrealistic expectations within the organization of what this design system was capable of doing. So we had created these things with a specific intentions in mind, but immediately the expectation was, oh, anyone could build anything from the pattern library. Like, it's so complete. They did such a great job. And the team saw the immediate value, and they wanted to use it on their projects. And that was really great. Like, that's a great feeling. But there were also a lot of problems with that, you know, we saw almost immediately. So we knew that we lacked good documentation for others to get up and running without oversight. It was 2 people working on projects. We set everything up together. It worked for us, and we kept going. We never took a step back to make sure that anybody who used this in the future would be able to do that. We also lacked consistent design support and documentation for making good decisions. I'm sure, like, some people here, their skin crawled when they heard developers were making the design decisions on what components to use. Luckily, like, you know, our developers had enough design sense that it worked out okay, but not every developer has that design mindset and might be forcing things where they shouldn't be. And we just lacked design support from then on to be able to ask those questions. So developers were kind of hung out to dry in that way. Lastly, we were limited by our tooling decisions really quickly. Because we were doing a 6-month project, we didn't have much time. We were really limited in how much time we could spend, like, focusing on the tooling. So we didn't have paralysis. We just rushed in and chose what we knew, what we could use. But that very quickly, like, showed some problems once we wanted to expand this beyond just 2 teams using it for 2 applications. So 4 years later, so we're going to skip 4 years later because I want to talk about how much evolution happened over the course of 4 years as the success metrics kept changing. We didn't have an opportunity to, like, stop and restart. We kept kind of adding to that system to make things better as we went along. So in terms of strategy, some of the things that occurred over those 4 years, we set up a backlog to keep track of the changes we wanted to make. So this actually took a lot longer than it should have. I think, like, maybe 2 years in, we decided, instead of talking about our ideas over and over and over again, we should actually keep track of them and put them somewhere where people can see them and start to want to help out. So we, in tandem with that backlog, we started to advocate for teams to pull in those stories from the backlog when they had time. So product development can kind of ebb and flow. When teams had downtime, those teams were aware that there was this backlog that had design system stuff on it that they could pull in and start working on. So that helped us, like, get engaged with the product teams, helped us get more active involvement from people who were just ready to go in terms of pulling work in. And then lastly, we had a UI architect who was overseeing UI work across teams. And we paired that person up with a design lead to have better co-ownership over the design system, to take it from being just that like developer driven system to being more of a true design system where both design and development have equal representation and are able to contribute. So the next section of things that we focused on was around documentation. We prioritized getting people set up on their own without having to talk to people. We found that this was a really good way to, continue to promote adoption. It's both scary and amazing when you find out that someone is using your design system that you've never talked to. When you don't know that people are using it, that's kind of awesome. So we, our documentation was sound enough that people were able to get up and running without us having to help. And then the other one is kind of a mix of documentation and communication, but we started to have regularly cadenced meetings where designers and developers would meet and talk very intensely about a single component to document intent and limitations from both the design and development perspective. And that documentation went right in line with the components in the pattern library. That way, when developers did need to make decisions, they were able to make more intelligent design decisions based off of documentation that was written from both the design and development perspective. And then the last area of focus that we had was around iteration for both tooling and for processes. So the first one here's a little technical, but we moved to a mono repo format, and then we used a tool called Lerna to deploy single component packages. We quickly learned that when we deployed a single package for the pattern library, there were some restrictions, especially around backwards compatibility, that was causing issues in specific applications as they tried to move forward. So changing our tooling and processing there really bought us some really high value of changing the way that things were deployed and consumed into applications. We moved to a custom pattern library to give us more flexibility. We had some features that we really wanted that didn't really exist in any pattern library tools at the time, such as like wanting to serve up HTML and React components side by side. We went with a custom solution at the time. Since that point, there have been many more tools that have been added that actually have that feature that works really well. So we actually just moved yet again. So we've done 2 really big tooling updates to the pattern library to make sure that we're keeping up with modern practices and allowing ourselves to continue to move forward. And then lastly, once our adoption process was a little more solid, we ended up pivoting to a slightly more complex process. Once we kind of eliminated the barrier of entry of it being difficult to use and people were using it, we found that we could leverage a lot more tooling, such as like an automatic change log. When we put a little bit more of a barrier of entry into place where people had to use a tool called Commitizn to write their commits in Git. But essentially that was a conscious decision to make our process a little bit more complex in order to have automated documentation so that we didn't have to constantly be remembering to update documentation. So it was, a small price to pay for a really big reward. And you're going to run into those kind of things while you're iterating is, trying to add to your process in order to have more gains from them. So in terms of what this looks like today versus what it started as, we've got 5 UI developers across 4 teams, but we're using an open source model. So the contribution usage from about 8 different product teams, and it's being consumed in 10 different products or applications. So we went from those 2 developers and 2 applications and have scaled up to contributions from a lot more people and a lot more applications. We greatly improved our collaboration with designers and now have more dedicated design support to the design system. So we moved away from that really one-sided system into having design and development being kind of equally at the table. And then lastly, we better improved our documentation and process by a lot. We went from about 0 to 100 there and have continued to make iterations on that over the course of the 4 years as we've made updates to other things as well. So that's actually all we have for today. I think we went a little bit past our time, but we did want to take some time to answer any questions that are out there. So I think, Phil, you're going to help us out with those.
I am. Great talk. I always learn a lot. I wrote a bunch of questions down myself, and we have 2 anonymous questions that are posted. I think I didn't realize there were going to be so many Fast and Furious references in there, so we probably shouldn't have called you guys the 2-person Destiny's Child. You're sort of the Hobbs and Shaw of design systems at Think Company.
I guess that's a more relevant analogy.
We better start off with, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, and that I've never even seen the Hobbs and Shaw movie, so I thought I would just throw that out there as a little non sequitur. Great stuff. I'm going to dive directly into some of the anonymous questions that were asked. We don't have any questions that for some reason, people don't want to talk directly to you, Shawn. I can understand that. So I'll ask their questions for them. The first one is the question is: successful design systems are so dependent on the culture of the organization that uses them. Do you have any suggestions on syncing your design system with an organization's culture? Like how do you get? I think you talked about this quite a bit in adoption and things like that. Like, how do you actually get folks to, accept the fact that they're working with a design system and contribute to it as opposed to resist against it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you or Amanda have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. Yeah, like the first thing I think of there is there's a lot of like different models with this, and I feel like an old school model would be that you have this like dictatorship of, okay, we in this like, ivory tower have developed this system, and now we're going to like shove it down everyone's throats and force it upon you. But I think there's so many options for people today to solve these problems that they'll just say, yeah, we'll use that. And then they don't. So I actually think like a better way is to follow more of like this open source mentality, and just to be more inclusive, because the more you get people involved, the more bought in they are, just like emotionally, right? Not even just like from a functional perspective, just like, yeah, I want this thing to succeed. And by them contributing to it, even in small ways, by giving you feedback or involving them in when you host events, that kind of thing, like those are really small things you can do to just like build this community around it, rather than, forcing people to use something. And Amanda, I don't know if you have any like follow-ups to that.
Yeah, I was just going to add that it depends on the culture. Like you don't want to restrict yourself to, if your company has a bad culture, you don't want to restrict yourself to aligning with that culture when you're trying to promote your design system. So like Shawn said, if it's kind of a dictatorship in terms of how things are generally done and communicated, like you don't want to follow that model, or you're going to have adoption problems because you're forcing something on people that they don't want to use. So yeah, it really depends. Like I think that if the culture is very open and making sure that people are included on things, like yeah, by all means follow along and align yourself with that. But flowing against the culture might be exactly what you need to do in order to get like adoption of your system to happen.
And I think that kind of gets to the ask for forgiveness versus permission thing. Like if you had to kind of describe the organization you're in, like which one is it? Like if you have to ask for forgiveness, like, is that going to be a problem? Or do you have to ask for permission for everything? And I think that's going to dictate like strategically how you approach this stuff,
Yeah. And it's interesting to me about the ask for forgiveness thing, because I think that those sort of resourceful, thoughtful people at times are resistant or almost embarrassed about the work that they're doing. So I know many times, in our situations, we're going out and talking to brand new clients and trying to assess the work that they want us to do for them. One of the first questions I'll ask is, do you have a design system? What's the state of, any elements of a design system? Is there a pattern library out there? How are your developers sharing that stuff? And And inevitably someone in the room will be like, well, I've got this thing over here, and they'll pull it up and show it. And, the lead engineer will look over and be like, that I didn't know that existed. Like, and they've created these things just to make life easier for themselves, and maybe don't feel like they have the authority to impose it on anything. And that's and that goes into the follow-up question to this, which was like, what kind of advice do you have for those with organizations that are actually having trouble adopting their design systems? And that goes back, I think, to the point that you made, Shawn, and Amanda, you tied into also, is like, with this notion of building it as sort of an internal open source platform, folks feel more ownership of it than if you're just saying, hey, from now on, this is what you're doing, so I don't know if you have any more you want to say about that.
Yeah, I think, I'll just speak from the design side here. But I know that a lot of designers, I think mistakenly see their value in like, oh, well, I'm in like the design tool making this beautiful thing, and that's the value that I bring. So when they see something like a design system come in, they see like, oh, well, that's the work I should be doing. And it's like, well, actually, you're much more valuable to put your brain towards solving a more complicated problem than the types of buttons we should be using, right? Like, there's some very basic things that a system can just like solve for you that you don't need people spending time rethinking when this problem has been solved 1,000 times already. And so I think it's a bit of like a resetting of expectations for even the teams adopting this, that like, hey, this is not here to like steal your job. This is here to make your job a lot easier. But again, I'm just speaking from the design side, because Amanda, I know you have more context on the dev side.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is kind of scattered throughout this presentation was the idea of like finding passionate people, because like the open source model isn't going to be enticing to everyone. Like, not everyone's going to want to have to contribute. Like, some people are just going to want to reap the benefits of what's there. Or they're, you're there to do your job. You're there to do what you're supposed to do on your product team. Contributing to a larger system doesn't really mean much to you. So seeking out like those passionate people and trying to focus on advocating for those people to have time is really helpful. Like, I think at some point on one of my projects, we tried to like set up governance for a design system and like figure out that ownership model of what was going to happen. And when we showed up to the first meeting, some of the development representatives, we were trying to talk about like why we were there. And one of them was like, well, I was kind of voluntold to be here. And I was like, well, that really kind of defeats the purpose of like being an owner of a system that you're passionate about. Like, I understand you're a very strong developer. Like, we would love to have you as an asset for this team, but if you don't have the passion for it, and you're supposed to be like an owner of this thing, like, you're going to do more harm than good here. So I like to focus a lot on trying to figure out the passionate side of people and finding promoting those people into helping out with these things more so than people who aren't interested in like accidentally forcing them into it.
Yeah, that's a great point. We actually have a comment by Norma. I'm going to see if she wants to talk live about it. But it ties into another question that I had coming up. So Norma, I don't know if you can hear me, but
yeah,
we can hear you if you speak. Yeah, you wanna bring up your comment with Shawn and Amanda?
Yeah, I was actually the writer on a team that was creating a design system, and they actually worked on the design system, created a lot of stuff, and did the typical process that happens with technical writers. They threw it over the fence and said, okay, document the design system. I'm like, what? And I started asking questions about this and that. And, oh, well, we didn't think about that. Oh, we didn't think about this. So when I was looking at your slides, Shawn, about the documentation, I'm like, oh my gosh, of course, you need to do it at the same time. And it's the beauty of collaboration, right? Because it's not the person who knows what they're doing. It's the other person commenting on it, saying that doesn't make sense to me, or what rules are you assuming people already know, things like that. So that was my experience.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, I feel your pain. And we have all read bad documentation before, and it's terrible. It's just like what is being said to me right now. But one of the things that's interesting is this is kind of like a re-education for the designers too, which is, hey, writing documentation, even if, you eventually are working with someone like yourself, Norma, who is like going to turn it into something coherent. It makes you a better designer, right?
Exactly.
It makes you think through the thing you're making. It's like, oh yeah, why did I do that? Like, we make so many design decisions all the time without thinking about why we did it. We just say oh, it just came to me, right? But there's a reason why we make these decisions, and by being able to articulate them, it just makes us much better designers overall. So I think it's just a good design practice to do.
Yeah.
I think some of my fondest memories of evolving a design system include sitting with Shawn in a room to talk about component documentation. Where from the outside looking in, it's probably the most boring and overly specific conversation ever, where we're talking about tables for 2 hours and just really hammering out the rules and stuff behind it. But it's really great, as a developer, being able to talk to the designer from the development side and bring in those kind of rules in addition to the design side and pairing that stuff together. Those meetings were a lot of fun. I looked forward to them all the time, even though it was just so nitty gritty, the stuff that we would get to.
Yeah.
But felt so good with the result after the fact.
Well, this team particular left off. They had a designer on their team, but he was not part of any of the product groups that were going to be using the design system. So again, it was like throw it over the fence, and those darn developers, they don't want to use this, they don't want to use that, and it was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I think that's an important lesson in the in this notion that's it's got to be a collaborative team. You've got to be working together on it, and I think there's a lot that designers can learn from developers as well. I know this ties into a story that I tell often around when we were building our technology team and I was interviewing folks to run it. Kimberly Blessing used to be the head of our technology group, and in her interview, the thing that sold me on her was when I was asking her about her philosophy towards hiring developers. She said, a good developer they don't write code, they design good code. They know that their code is going to be inherited by people. No block of code is ever going to sit untouched ever again. And so they need to come from a philosophy of I'm building something that other people are going to be using for an undetermined amount of time. And that's a completely different perspective towards putting code down than just getting the job done. But I think that's something that developers, just by their very nature these days, know and understand. And it's inherent in the practice of developers, but that's not necessarily something that designers think about. They think hey, I'm going to design this pattern, but I have to design this pattern to be reused by a population of people for a long period of time. There's no question there. I just thought I would editorialize. Thanks for your comment, Norma.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Norma.
Okay, we don't have any other questions. There's one question that came up, Amanda, during your part of the talk that I just wanted to dig into a little bit. I haven't seen this talk before, so I kind of learned a lot from it and took a bunch of notes. I could ask questions for an hour, but I'll spare everyone on it. But you were talking about this idea that the platform that you were telling the story about has you've retooled it multiple times now. And I'm just curious what those conversations, what those conversations sounded like, where it's hey, we retooled this a couple of years ago and solved a whole bunch of problems, but it's time to do it again. And how do you sort of approach that, and how do you get the whole team on board and the stakeholders on board for something like that as well?
Yeah. So the first time that we retooled it, it was actually a holiday for the client that we were working for. And so we had a full day and we were like, what should we work on? And so we were like, let's do a proof of concept of moving this thing from the platform we're on today to where we want to be. So, we did a little bit of that, asking for forgiveness of we had a day and we went for it, because we had talked a lot about all those growth problems and things that were issues. And when we did the first replatform, we presented it as, hey, there is no good solution for what we want to do. We would like to move to this custom solution until this other thing might be done. So we want to try and like move this with as much like the minimal effort we can possibly put it into in order to set ourselves up to retool it easier in the future. And so that was kind of how we sold it the first time, was just letting people know that, yes, there are problems. We never built it to scale this way. There's no good tool at the moment, so we need to rely on something custom until to buy us time to like move to something else. So there always was kind of an expectation that we would move again. So that was part of it. But the other part of it is that while we were continuously evolving the system, we continued to make steps towards making the tool kind of the least important part of what was happening so that we could swap tools out more easily. So for example, we reorganized things in the context of the current tooling. That way, when we knew when we could move to the new tooling, we could move things with no risk. And so while there were two main big initiatives and big pushes to like sell that new tooling and do it, we made sure that the way that we evolved our systems, we weren't so dependent on a single tool, and we were organized in a way that we could pivot to a new one. That when the time came, it was a pretty easy sell. I think the other thing is that the developers on the team and the people using the tools share a lot of that same design system passion and have seen a lot of the improvements in tools, and were making very similar complaints. So there were enough people who were like totally gung-ho about doing this thing that it wasn't too hard of a sell. Like we knew that we needed to do this. We had anticipated that we would do it, and we went for it. So you know, the shorter answer there to like someone who is trying to do something similar in their organization, like proof of concepts are great. Like showing off the capabilities of a new tool, getting buy-in from people that you know will really help. You know, the new tool that we moved to was Storybook, and we were able to show off some of those features to the designers, and the designers were like, oh yeah, we want that too. Nice. So we were able to show a lot of the value in the new tool before we even moved to it, and get buy-in from people all over the place. And then because we were making incremental change before we got there, by the time it was time to like do this big tool, we had like 2 people who were really working on it behind the scenes over the course of like 3 weeks. So it wasn't like this huge project that we had to undertake. We set ourselves up for success in knowing that we might want to move in the future.
That's great. Yeah, that's great advice too. I mean, we're getting. I mean, we're over 4 o'clock. I think we've, you know, our attendee list kind of dwindled down a little bit. I don't know if you, if either of you have a few final words or final thoughts you want to throw out there. I mean, the one thing before I hand it back over to you is that I heard in you know, that I've heard in Shawn's presentations in the past, and I heard this time was, you know, that a design system is like an internal product. You've got to treat it like a product in order for it to be successful. And this time, you know, treating it like a startup is sort of the same thing. That idea of like, you know, bootstrapping it, you know, to get it started or something like that. And I think that's great advice. But I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, or any other last words before we go.
I mean, that's like, whenever I talk to anyone about design systems, that's the point I want to drive home, is like, when you start a design system, you are now saying, okay, we're taking on this new product for our company. It's an internal product that serves our other our other like customer facing products. But you really need to treat it like that and staff it that way, give it the resources it needs, because otherwise it's not going to work. You know? Yeah. It's like a negative way to end it, but I didn't mean to do that.
No.
Yeah.
I'm gonna end it more positively. No.
Yeah. Oh, smile. Yeah, smile.
I think one of the points in this presentation that I really like is the idea of being realistic. Like, we know that it is so hard to sell design systems within your own organization. like we do it all the time to other organizations, and you know, we even try to sell it in our own organizations in some ways, and also see feedback or pushback rather. And it's hard work. Like it's hard work going up against people who can't see the value in the same way that you see it. And a lot of what it comes down to when you're evolving a system is, you know, passionate people who are not going to be discouraged and are going to continue to power through and try to find solutions to these problems. So, you know, kudos to everybody out there who is wearing the design system hat and running against people who are questioning its value. And, you know, hopefully some of the points in this talk help give you the ammunition you need to be able to, you know, do some things to help yourself and save your own sanity in some ways.
Yeah, there's some great positive words to end on. Very well done.
Amanda,
you
you
said
saved
Shawn's
us.
the optimist.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, geez.
Yeah, you saved us. You saved us there. All right, well, great. Let's. I'm gonna hit the wrap up points here. If you can see my. Oh, good. I'm getting a beach ball. Can you? Which screen are you looking at right now?
Let me see wrap up slide.
Nice. All right, I shared the right screen. All right, so we're going to be sending out a follow-up email with links to anything that Amanda and Shawn referenced, plus the recording, so you can share it with any of your friends and colleagues who want to, you think may benefit from this talk. We'd love your feedback. We're going to send out in that link a 2-minute survey that you can fill out. It's only a few questions. If you want to have a virtual coffee with Shawn and Amanda, then you can sign up using a link that's going to be in that email as well. If you want to chat more with them directly about design systems. And be sure to sign up for our upcoming webinar, Build Something Great, 6 Principles for Building a Great Company with our founder, Brian McIntyre, on June 4th. So without any further ado, I'd love to thank everyone here and thank Shawn and Amanda for a great talk and answering some good questions. And I hope everyone stays safe, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.